Imagine waking up and discovering that the numbers on your screen, the ones you spent 26 years cultivating through sacrifice and discipline, are now nothing more than a mathematical joke. We're not talking about a stock market drop or a temporary crisis. We're talking about the exact moment when the system decides that your effort no longer has any weight. In January 1992, the financial world witnessed a correction so violent that prices rose 345% in just 4 weeks. If you had $14,000 in the bank, the equivalent of the price of a house or a lifetime of work, in 30 days, that amount could barely buy a pair of low-quality boots. The conflict here is not against an external enemy, but against the very nature of fiat currency. Money, which should be a store of time and energy, was turned into smoke by a decree that freed prices without prior warning. The initial shock is not only financial, it is psychological. How can a system allow the bank balance to remain intact while purchasing power is being crushed? The incidence of this conflict reveals a brutal truth about the fragility of the middle class. Those who did everything right, those who saved, those who avoided debt and trusted bank custody, were precisely the ones most punished. While the government adjusted the gears of the economy, accumulated inflation reached 2,500% in a single year. This means that with every passing hour, your work was worth less. If your salary was deposited on Monday, by Friday it no longer paid for the same calories. It is a feeling of absolute helplessness, where the logic of financial mathematics is replaced by the desperation of survival. The system that promised stability became the engine of accelerated poverty. Here the first great mystery of this dynamic is born. If money was disappearing from the hands of those who produced, where exactly was that wealth being drained in real time? Someone was getting the counterpart of that loss, but the clues to its whereabouts were hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and new decrees. The emotional impact of this is a silent anger that corrodes confidence in tomorrow. Imagine the feeling of looking at your bank statement and realizing that the numbers are still there, unchanged, but the physical reality around you has changed. Shelves empty out, the faces on the streets lose their brightness, and the dignity of those who always worked honestly is exchanged for the breadline. It is the end of the illusion of security. The money saved was not a guarantee. It was only a record in a database that the state decided to ignore. When the financial system collapses, it does not only break companies, it breaks the social contract. Individual discipline, which was always preached as the path to freedom, became the chain that trapped millions in misery. There is an invisible mechanism that operates in these moments, a tool that few know, capable of protecting assets even when paper currency dies. But at the time, no one knew how to access it. The collapse of 1992 was the ultimate laboratory for understanding what happens when trust disappears. If you're trying to understand how these mechanisms of power and wealth work, so you do not become the next victim, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. It is essential that you leave in the comments what you think of this explanation and tell us which city or country you are watching from right now, so we can understand how this perception of value changes in different places around the world. The history of money is the history of those who can see through the smoke before it turns into fire. The development of this collapse reveals a perverse mechanism, the death of currency through velocity of circulation. When inflation reaches the level of 2,500%, the dollar stops being a unit of account and becomes a hot potato that no one wants to hold. The phenomenon is devastating for human planning, because without a stable currency, the future ceases to exist. Imagine that you are a supplier of metal parts. You deliver the product today, but payment only arrives in 30 days. By the moment the money enters your account, the cost of steel to replenish inventory has already tripled. The immediate result is paralysis. Factories, once symbols of productivity and engineering, turn into graveyards of machines where wages simply stopped being paid. It was in this scenario that the barter economy emerged, where real value was forced to detach itself from nominal value. The system regressed centuries in a matter of months. The irony of this conflict is that the shortage of paper currency with real value created absurd situations. Companies began paying their employees with what they produced. Engineers received engines. Teachers received notebooks or tires. The challenge now was turning a diesel engine into food on the table. This desperate search for liquidity created a parallel market where merchandise was the only law. But here lies the second loop of this narrative. While the population was getting lost in impossible calculations of converting products into bread, a silent elite connected to the centers of power was doing exactly the opposite. They did not want the money that was dying. They wanted the assets that money used to buy. How is it possible that, in the middle of mass impoverishment, the most valuable assets in the country were being transferred into private hands so quickly and efficiently? The answer lay in a privatization mechanism designed to be incomprehensible to the ordinary citizen. The conflict deepens when we realize that hyperinflation is not a natural disaster, but a transfer of wealth. When the government frees prices, it is, in practice, taxing those who have savings and subsidizing those who have physical assets or access to cheap credit. The emotional despair of this phase is marked by the feeling of betrayal. The discipline of those who saved $14,000 was used to finance the transition of the system to the new owners of capital. The middle class was the battery that supplied the energy for the new system to be switched on, but that battery was discarded after use. It is a moment of absolute anger. Seeing decades of effort diluted to clean up the debts of a failed state is an experience that destroys the moral compass of any society. If work does not guarantee survival, what does? In this vacuum of order, survival came to depend on skills that the educational system had never taught. The focus shifted from abstract finance to raw logistics. It was the period in which informal commerce became the backbone of the nation. People with higher education, doctors and specialists, found themselves forced to travel thousands of kilometers to buy clothes, electronics, or basic utilities in other countries to resell on improvised sidewalks. The dollar, although it continued to be the name of the currency on the bank statement, was now a ghost. Reality was the weight of the suitcase, the cold of the border, and direct negotiation. Value had migrated from the bank to movement. But, strangely, even with visible chaos, there was one sector that seemed immune to the disaster, operating on a frequency that the ordinary citizen could not tune into. The psychology of financial crisis is fertile territory for predators. When inflation destroys logic, human beings begin to believe in miracles. It was exactly here that the phenomenon of financial pyramids on a national scale emerged. Millions of people who had just lost everything to the government handed over what little remained to schemes promising impossible returns. The mystery here is the repetition of the mistake. Why would someone who saw their money evaporate in a state bank trust a television advertisement promising profits of 1,000% per month? The answer is fear of the future. Desperation nullifies analytical capacity and creates a vulnerability that is exploited with surgical precision by those who understand mass manipulation. The final conflict of this block is not only about the loss of money, but about the loss of identity. Who was Maksim without his factory? Who was Svetlana without her classroom? When the economic system collapses, it drags social labels down with it. The struggle was no longer for comfort or status, but for the maintenance of basic life. Paper dollars were useless, the bank balance was a painful memory, and government promises were noise. What remained was willpower and tangible assets. The great lesson beginning to emerge from this chaos is that, in a collapse, what you know how to do and what you physically own are the only things the system cannot inflate into oblivion. And it is here that the power structure begins to show its deepest cracks, revealing who is truly profiting from the fire. The climax of this collapse does not occur in carpeted offices, but at the moment when physical reality definitively crushes financial abstraction. When inflation reaches its peak, time becomes the scarcest and most expensive resource in the economy. The dollar ceases to be a store of value and becomes a countdown timer. If you received $10,000 at 9 in the morning, by 5 in the afternoon that amount no longer bought the same supplies. The speed of money surpassed the speed of human logistics. It is the breaking point where the nervous system of society goes into failure. Shelves do not become empty only because there is no money. They become empty because no merchant is insane enough to trade a real good for paper that rots in his hands before sunset. It is the final victory of the tangible asset over the promise of the state. In this scorched earth scenario, the first great twist emerges: the rise of the oligarchs in the vacuum of hopelessness. While millions of citizens focused on how to get the next piece of bread, a technical and political elite operated on a completely different dimensional plane. They were not playing the game of survival, but the game of appropriation. Through a system of vouchers and obscure privatizations, entire industries, nickel mines, oil fields, and power plants were handed over to a handful of men for a ridiculously small fraction of their real value. How is this possible? The answer is the third loop of this story. Financial ignorance was the weapon of mass destruction used against the people. The population received papers representing shares of state companies, but hungry and desperate for immediate liquidity, they traded those shares for bottles of vodka or food baskets. They sold the future for a lunch, without understanding that they were handing over the keys of the country to the new masters of capital. The emotional climax reaches its peak when the citizen realizes that the crisis was not a miscalculation, but a transfer project. The pain of seeing 26 years of work converted into nothing is replaced by an icy fury when seeing the newly rich displaying luxury in the middle of garbage. The dollars that Maksim saved served to stabilize the balance of payments that allowed insiders to buy real assets. It is the realization that you were the involuntary guarantor of the wealth of those who enslaved you. The financial system, at its most critical point, becomes a machine that grinds human flesh to produce diamonds for a few. Wealth did not disappear from the planet. It merely changed postal codes, leaving the savings accounts of the middle class and entering the offshore investment funds of those who knew what was coming. At this point, the second twist occurs: the discovery that the state is the worst possible custodian in times of transition. Those who were rebels, who kept resources outside the system, who negotiated illegally, or who invested in practical skills and physical goods, were the only ones who kept their heads above water. The state bank, which should have been the safe harbor, became the epicenter of the shipwreck. The money that Maksim saw on the screen was, in reality, a liability of the state that the state decided not to pay. Real wealth was in the garden of the dacha, in Svetlana's ability to cross borders, and in the network of contacts that allowed the exchange of an engine for sacks of potatoes. The collapse revealed that the true economy is biological and technical, not bureaucratic. The moment of greatest tension arises when the financial pyramid collapses shortly after hyperinflation. It is the coup de grace. The people, already exhausted by the government's betrayal, sought refuge in the promise of magical profits. The image of thousands of people camping in front of closed offices, holding paper certificates worth even less than the inflated dollar, is the visual representation of the death of hope. Desperation created a collective blindness. The mystery of why brilliant and educated minds fell into an obvious scheme is resolved here. Financial trauma shuts down the prefrontal cortex. The fear of absolute poverty is a powerful narcotic that makes any lie seem like an emergency exit. The system did not only steal Maksim's past, it hijacked his ability to reason about the future. The brutal lesson of this chapter is that money is a contract of trust And when the issuer of that contract is corrupt or incompetent, paper becomes a weapon against the holder. The climax does not end with a magical solution, but with the acceptance of a cold reality. The old order died, and the new order is predatory. Security is a superstition. To survive, it was necessary to abandon the ethic of saving and adopt the ethic of agility. Static dollars in the bank were the anchor that sank the ship. What saved the survivors was movement, land, and sweat, proving that at the limits of civilization, electronic digits are the first to evaporate, leaving behind only what is solid, what is edible, and what is tradable. The resolution of this economic tragedy did not come through a new decree or a government rescue, but through the recognition of a hard truth. The system is not coming back for you. The survival of those who crossed the desert of 1992 and 1993 depended on a forced mental migration from abstraction to the concrete. Maksim and Svetlana did not recover their $14,000. They simply learned that those numbers belonged to a world that no longer existed. The satisfying resolution, if we can call it that, was born from the land. The dacha, the small country home that had once been a leisure refuge, became the family's central unit of production. While the banking system operated in a dimension of fiction and paper, the vegetable garden operated in the dimension of calories and life. The potato planted, harvested, and stored was the only currency that did not suffer inflation. This is the moment when the fourth loop closes. The discovery that true financial independence is not having a lot of money, but needing little from the system. The mystery of how a family survived the loss of an entire lifetime of savings is resolved through the diversification of skills. Svetlana, by abandoning the chalk and blackboard to become an informal trader in Poland, personified the resilience of human capital. She transformed her ability to learn and negotiate into an asset that no state bank could freeze. Wealth migrated from the bank balance to sweat and logistics. The moral lesson here is deep and uncomfortable. The system rewards obedience in times of peace, but annihilates the obedient in times of collapse. Maksim, the engineer who did everything right, was saved by the wife who had the courage to do what the system considered informal or undignified. The transition to the relative stability of the following years was not a return to normal, but the birth of a new consciousness. The collapse left scars that no appreciation of the dollar could erase. The population learned that money is an instrument of control as much as it is a medium of exchange. The resolution of this story teaches us that in any economy, the weakest link is always the one who blindly believes in the permanence of institutions. When the financial system becomes too complex, it becomes inherently fragile. Real security, as Maksim discovered, lies in what you can physically control: your house, your land, your tools, and your network of mutual support. Trust, once broken on a national scale, is never fully restored. It transforms into a healthy skepticism that is the only real protection against the next bubble or the next silent confiscation. The great moral lesson this journey leaves for the modern viewer is that inflation is not only an economic phenomenon, it is a moral erosion. It rewards the debtor and punishes the saver. It benefits the insider and destroys the honest worker. If you base your security only on financial assets that depend on the promise of third parties, you are living under the roof of a house that does not belong to you. The story of Maksim and Svetlana is a reminder that the gold of a lifetime of work can be turned into lead by the simple touch of an official pen. Therefore, the true wealth strategy is not to accumulate digits, but to accumulate resilience. Diversify not only your investments, but your skills. Have assets that possess intrinsic value, regardless of what the government says the currency is worth today. The outcome of this process reveals that the inequality generated by the collapse was not an accident, but the inevitable result of a system where money has no backing in productive reality. The oligarchs who rose from those ashes are the living reminder that, while the middle class mourns what it lost, the architects of a system celebrate what they captured. The resolution for the ordinary individual is not to try to beat the system at its own game, but to build a personal ecosystem that is as independent as possible from the fluctuations of that game. Real value is what remains when the illusion ends. Freedom is not the balance in the account. It is the absence of fear when that balance reaches zero. If you made it this far, you understood that the numbers on your screen are only part of the story. The true protection against the invisible is knowledge and preparation. If you want to continue understanding how to protect your financial reality and not be caught by surprise by the gears of power, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Leave in the comments what this story awakened in you, and write which city or country you are following our content from. Your perception is what helps us build a clearer vision of the future. Remember, the system can change the rules, but cannot change the value of those who know how the game really works. Knowledge is the only asset that no one can inflate.